The beacon appeared on a Tuesday. It came out of nowhere, a massive object, black and smooth like polished stone, sitting at the edge of the Sol system as if it had always been there. Every satellite, every deep space telescope, every listening station on Earth and Mars picked up its signal at the same moment. The message was short. It repeated every 30 seconds. And it was translated into every human language at once, as if whoever sent it already knew everything about the people of Earth. Species 4217. Designation, human. You are summoned to the Hall of Tribute. Compliance is not optional. That was all it said. No greeting, no explanation, just an order. Within hours, the world changed. News channels ran the message on loop. Governments held emergency sessions behind closed doors. Religious leaders called for calm. Scientists called for caution. Generals called for weapons. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, a decision had to be made. Someone had to go. Captain Tejo was not the most decorated officer in Earth's fleet. He was not the loudest voice in the room. He did not give grand speeches or wave flags. What Tejo did was simple. He stayed calm when no one else could. He had commanded the first deep space patrol beyond Neptune. He had negotiated a mining dispute between 3 colony stations without a single shot fired. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, people trusted him. That was why they chose him. Dr. Yuna was chosen for a different reason. She was the best xenolinguist on Earth, a woman who had spent 15 years studying alien signal patterns that most people thought were just noise. She had argued for years that the galaxy was full of intelligent life, and that one day that life would come knocking. No one had believed her. Now, everyone needed her. Yuna was quiet. She wore her hair pulled back and kept her eyes on her work. She did not smile often. But when she did, it was warm and real. She had a habit of pausing before she answered any question, as if she were weighing every word on a scale. Tejo liked that about her. In his experience, people who thought before they spoke were the ones worth listening to. Lieutenant Dowen completed the team. He was Tejo's tactical officer, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and suspicious of everything. Dowen had grown up on a colony station orbiting Jupiter, where trust was something you earned with your hands, not your words. He did not like aliens, he did not like politicians, and he especially did not like the idea of flying into unknown space because a giant rock told them to. But Tejo asked him to come, so he came. That was the kind of man Dowen was. The ship they took was called the Horizon. It was not a warship. It was a diplomatic vessel, fast, lightly armed, built for talking rather than fighting. It carried a crew of 42, including 6 Marines in polished gray armor who stood near the airlock and said very little. The journey took 11 days. During that time, Yuna barely slept. She spent every hour in the communications room, listening to intercepted galactic broadcasts that the beacon's arrival had somehow unlocked. There were thousands of them, transmissions from species humanity had never heard of, in languages no human had ever spoken. But Yuna was patient. She found patterns. She cross-referenced. She built a picture. And that picture frightened her. She brought her findings to Tejo on the 9th night, in the quiet observation deck at the front of the ship. Stars drifted past the window like slow rain. Every species that has been contacted by the Council has been given the same message we received, she said. A summons, a demand. They call it the tribute. Tejo leaned against the railing and looked at her. What kind of tribute? Resources, territory, military control. It depends on the species. But the pattern is the same. The Council takes what it wants, and in return, the species is allowed to exist. They call it protection. It is not protection. What is it? Yuna paused. She chose her word carefully, Ownership. Tejo was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, a distant nebula glowed soft blue and purple, beautiful and completely indifferent to the small ship passing through it. "Has anyone ever refused?" he asked. Yuna nodded slowly. "A few, maybe 5 or 6 species in the last 100,000 years. Their names appear in early broadcasts, and then they disappear. Completely. No signals, no records, no trace. The Council does not just defeat them, Tejo. It erases them." Darwin, who had been standing in the doorway listening without announcement, spoke up. "So, we're flying into a trap." "We are flying into a choice," Yuna corrected him gently. Darwin crossed his arms. "Same thing." Tejo looked at both of them. He did not argue. He did not give a speech about bravery or duty or the future of humanity. He simply asked Yuna one question. "What do you think we should do?" Yuna turned to the window. The stars reflected in her dark eyes. "We listen first," she said. "Then we decide who we are." On the 11th day, the horizon dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and the crew saw the pale throne for the first time. It was not a space station. It was not a ship. It was something else entirely. A structure so vast that it made planets look small. It hung in the darkness like a cathedral built by gods, pale white and glowing faintly, covered in towers and spires, and docking arms that stretched out in every direction, like the branches of an enormous tree. Around it, thousands of alien warships orbited in slow, silent formation. Some were the size of cities. Some were shaped like things that had no name in any human language. The crew of the Horizon stood at the windows and stared. No one spoke. Then the transmission came. It was not a greeting. It was not a welcome. It was a command, cold and absolute, echoing through every speaker on the ship. "Human vessel, you will dock, you will kneel, you will pay." Tejo stood on the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, and looked at the impossibly huge structure ahead of them. He took a slow breath. "Dock the ship," he said quietly. "Let us see what they want." The inside of the pale throne smelled like nothing. That was the first thing Yuna noticed. No air recycler hum, no metal tang, no warmth, just nothing, as if the atmosphere itself had been scrubbed clean of anything alive. The corridors were enormous, wide enough for creatures 10 times the size of a human, and the walls glowed with a pale, cold light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They walked in formation, Tejo in front, calm and steady. Yuna beside him, her translator device held against her chest like a shield. Behind them, Darwin and 6 Marines moved in tight step, boots clicking against the smooth white floor. None of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Alien escorts led them forward, tall, thin creatures with gray skin and too many joints in their arms. They did not look at the humans. Everything about their movements said the same thing. You are small, you are temporary, and you do not matter. The Hall of Tribute was at the center of the station. When the doors opened, Tejo stopped walking for exactly 1 second. He could not help it. The hall was the size of a small country. A vast amphitheater built in tiers that rose so high the upper rows disappeared into a soft haze. Thousands of species sat in those rows, creatures of every shape, size, and color that nature and evolution could imagine. Some had wings, some had shells, some floated in liquid-filled chambers. Some were nothing more than light held together in a vague shape. And every single one of them was watching the small group of humans walking toward the center of the floor. Yuna felt the weight of those eyes, not just hundreds, not just thousands, millions, watching through broadcast relays across the galaxy. This was not just a ceremony, it was a spectacle, a reminder to every species in the Council of what happened when you were small and new and alone. At the far end of the hall, raised above everything else on a platform of white crystal, sat the Grand Arbiter, Volmari. He was ancient. That was clear even from a distance. His body was insectoid, 7 limbs folded beneath robes made of living crystal that shifted color with each slow movement. His head was narrow and angular, with 4 black eyes that reflected the light of the hall like wet glass. He had held his position for over 9,000 years. In that time, he had overseen more than 300 tribute ceremonies. Every single one had ended the same way. The new species knelt. The new species paid. The galaxy continued in its perfect, frozen order. Volmari began to speak. His voice did not come from his mouth. It came from the walls, the floor, the air itself, amplified and translated simultaneously into every language in the hall. It was smooth and unhurried, the voice of someone who had never once been interrupted. He spoke of order. He spoke of the wisdom of the council. He spoke of the great generosity shown to younger species, how the council allowed them to survive, to grow, to exist within the shelter of its ancient power. He spoke for a long time. Yuna translated every word into Teho's earpiece, her voice low and steady. Then came the demand. A junior arbiter stepped forward and read from a glowing document that floated in the air before him. The terms were precise. Humanity would surrender 40% of its colony worlds. 60% of its rare mineral reserves would be transferred to Council control. Earth's entire military fleet would be placed under Council oversight, to be used as the Council saw fit. In return, humanity would receive protected status, the right to continue existing, as long as it obeyed. Dowen's jaw tightened. His hand drifted toward his sidearm. Yuna placed her fingers lightly on his wrist, without looking at him, and he stopped. Volmari leaned forward on his platform. His crystal robes chimed softly. "Does the species known as human accept the tribute?" he said, "and in doing so, accept its place beneath the council's light?" The hall fell silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your chest and fills your ears with the sound of your own heartbeat. 4,000 species held their breath. Millions more watched from distant worlds. And at the center of it all, a single human stood under lights that were older than his entire civilization. Teho looked at Yuna. She looked back at him. Her face was calm. Her eyes were not. In them, Teho saw everything. The intercepted broadcasts, the erased species, the 100,000 years of silence and submission that had built this hall and everything it stood for. It was barely a movement at all, but it was enough. Teho turned back to Volmari. He stepped forward to the central podium. He was not a tall man. He was not physically impressive. He wore a simple gray uniform with no medals and no decorations. He looked, by every measure, like exactly what the council expected. Something small, something afraid, something that would bend. He opened his mouth and spoke one word. No. It went through the universal translator and hit every ear, every sensor, every receiver in the hall at the same time. One syllable, 2 letters, the simplest word in any language. And it broke everything. The silence that followed was not the same as before. Before, it had been expectation. Now it was shock. Pure, frozen, disbelieving shock. No species had ever said that word on the tribute floor. Not once in 100,000 years. Murmuring began. Then it grew. Then it became something close to chaos. Translators crackled. Signals flew between species who had not spoken to each other in centuries. On his platform, Volmari did not move, but his crystal robes, living things that responded to his body, cracked. Fine lines spread across their surface like fractures in ice. It was a sign of profound shock in his species, an involuntary response that he could not hide and could not control. His 4 black eyes locked onto Teho, and for the first time in 9,000 years, The Grand Arbiter did not know what to say. High in the upper tiers, far from the tribute floor, Delegate Ressi sat in her observation seat and watched. She was reptilian, green-scaled, golden-eyed, from a mid-tier species that had paid its own tribute 4,000 years ago. She had come to this ceremony expecting the same thing she always saw: submission, another species broken. Instead, she watched a creature half her size stand alone on a white floor and say the one word that no one in the galaxy dared to speak. She whispered to herself, so quietly that no translator picked it up. They are either the bravest creatures in the galaxy or the most foolish. Below, Volmari finally spoke. His voice was no longer smooth. There was something in it now, something old and cold and dangerous. Then you have chosen extinction, he said. The Purge fleet will be dispatched to your home system within one rotation. Tejo did not flinch. He did not step back. He stood exactly where he was, looked up at the ancient arbiter on his crystal throne, and said nothing more. He had said the only word that mattered. Behind him, Dowan exhaled slowly through his nose and thought, so, this is how it starts. And across the galaxy, in 100,000 relay stations and hidden receivers, the word played again and again and again. No. 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 The news reached Earth before Tejo's official report did. Somehow, someone had intercepted the broadcast from the Hall of Tribute and sent it bouncing through every relay station between the Pale Throne and the Sol system. By the time the United Defense Council received Tejo's coded message, every person on Earth, Mars, and the outer colonies had already seen it. They had watched their captain stand on an alien floor, surrounded by thousands of species, older and more powerful than humanity had ever imagined, and say the one word that no one in the galaxy had dared to speak in 100,000 years. The reactions were immediate and divided. Some people cheered. Some people wept. Some sat in silence, staring at their screens, trying to understand what it meant, what it would cost. Admiral Jihei did not do any of those things. She was standing in the war room of the Combined Fleet headquarters, on the dark side of the moon, when the broadcast arrived. She watched it once. Then she watched it again. Then she turned to the room full of officers who were all looking at her with wide, uncertain eyes, and she said 5 words. Activate the Ember Protocol. There was no hesitation in her voice. Jihei was not the kind of person who hesitated. She was 53 years old, tall and lean, with short gray hair, and a face that gave away nothing. She had spent 30 years in the military, rising through ranks not because she was loud or ambitious, but because she was right. She had a gift for seeing the shape of a problem before anyone else, and she had spent the last decade quietly building something that most people did not know existed. A contingency plan for the day that something bigger than humanity came to take what was theirs. The Ember Protocol was that plan. Within hours, the system transformed. Colony stations went dark, cutting all non-essential communications. Civilian ships were recalled to hardened ports. The Combined Fleet, every warship, every patrol craft, every armed transport that humanity owned, began converging on a single point, the outer boundary of the Sol system, near the Oort cloud. On Mars, a young engineer named Suho watched the mobilization from the window of his small apartment in the Valles Marineris settlement. He was 26. He built things for a living: hull plating, power conduits, atmospheric processors. Simple, honest work. He had never held a weapon. He had never been in a fight. And now he was watching troop transports lift off from the landing pads below his window, one after another, rising into the thin Martian sky like sparks from a fire. His communicator buzzed, a message from the shipyard where he worked. All civilian engineers were being called in. They needed hands. They needed everyone. Suho put on his jacket and went. Hundreds of workers moved between half-finished ships, welding armor plates onto cargo haulers, mounting weapons onto mining vessels, turning everything that could fly into something that could fight. It was not elegant work. It was desperate, rough, ugly work. The kind of work you did when you knew that perfection was a luxury and survival was not. Suho found his station and started cutting. The woman next to him was a school teacher. The man across from her was a baker. None of them were soldiers. All of them were there. Far away, on the pale throne, Taeho and his crew were being held in a sealed section of the station. Not a prison. The council did not consider them important enough to imprison. They were simply contained, like insects under a glass, while the purge fleet was prepared. But Yuna was not idle. She had spent her career listening to alien signals, finding patterns in noise, building bridges out of fragments. Now, she used those skills for something more urgent. Using a small hidden transmitter built into her translator device, she began reaching out to delegates in the hall. Not the powerful ones, not the ones who sat in the high tiers and looked down with cold eyes. She reached out to the ones in the middle rows, the ones who had watched Taeho say no and had not looked away. The ones whose faces, or whatever they had instead of faces, had shown something other than pity. She found Resi. The reptilian delegate was cautious. She communicated through encrypted microbursts that lasted less than a second each, terrified of being caught. But she talked, and what she told Yuna confirmed everything. Many of us have wanted to say that word for centuries, Resi transmitted. Your captain did not just refuse the council. He reminded us that refusal was possible. Will you help us? Yuna asked. A long pause. Then, I cannot fight your war, but I can open a door. Resi gave Yuna access to a private communication channel, one that the council did not monitor. Through it, Yuna sent a single coded message to Admiral Jihei on Earth. It was short because it had to be. Every second on the channel was a risk. They are afraid of what they do not understand. Give them something they cannot comprehend. Jihei received the message in the war room. She read it twice. Then she pulled up every piece of intelligence they had gathered on the Council's purge fleet. The data was terrifying. Over 80,000 warships. Some of them were older than human civilization itself. They carried weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand stars. By every measure of raw power, the purge fleet was unstoppable. But Jihei did not look at raw power. She looked at patterns. And what she saw made her lean back in her chair and close her eyes for a long moment. The purge fleet had not fought a real battle in over 40,000 years. Every species it had been sent to destroy had either surrendered before it arrived or been so technologically inferior that the fight lasted hours. The fleet was enormous, yes. Ancient, yes. Powerful beyond imagination, yes. But it was also slow, rigid, predictable. It moved in the same formations it had used for millennia. It relied on a centralized command structure, where every order came from a single flagship. And its commanders had never, not once, faced an enemy that fought back with anything resembling creativity. Jihei opened her eyes. She looked at the tactical display showing the purge fleet beginning its long march towards Seoul. 80,000 points of light, moving in perfect, arrogant formation. She thought of Suho on Mars, cutting armor plates with shaking hands. She thought of Taeho, on the pale throne, standing alone on a white floor. She thought of every person on every colony, and every station, and every small blue-green planet who was right now looking up at the sky and wondering if tomorrow would come. Then she stood, straightened her uniform, and walked to the bridge of her flagship, the Undying Soul. It was not the biggest ship in the fleet. It was not the strongest, but it was hers. and she knew every rivet and wire inside it, like she knew her own heartbeat. She looked at the tactical display one last time. The Purge fleet filled the screen, a wall of light stretching across the void, coming for everything she had ever known. "Let them come," she said. The Purge fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system, expecting silence. That was what always happened. The small species ran. The small species hid. The small species begged. And then the Purge fleet swept through their worlds like a fire through dry grass. And when it was done, there was nothing left. Not even a name. But when 80,000 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the Oort cloud, they found something unexpected. Nothing. No ships, no stations, no defense platforms, no panic transmissions. Just the cold, endless dark of deep space, filled with billions of chunks of ancient ice and rock, drifting slowly in the void. And in the middle of all that nothing, a single small beacon, no bigger than a human fist, floating alone and broadcasting a message on every frequency. You were warned. The fleet commander, an ancient creature called Talvar, who had led 7 purges and had never once been challenged, looked at the message with 4 of his 6 eyes and felt something he did not recognize. It took him a moment to understand what it was. It was confusion. He had not been confused in 3,000 years. He pushed the feeling aside and gave the order. Move forward. Stand in formation. Sweep and destroy. The fleet moved. 80,000 ships pushed through the Oort cloud in a formation that was older than most civilizations. A massive wall of warships, shoulder to shoulder, designed to overwhelm through sheer size and power. It would work again. The first mine detonated 6 minutes later. It was hidden inside a chunk of ice the size of a building. When the lead ship passed within range, the mine activated, punched through the ship's shields, and tore it apart in a flash of white light. Before the debris had finished spreading, 100 more mines detonated. Then 1,000. Then 10,000. The entire Oort cloud came alive. Humanity had spent months hiding autonomous mines inside the cometary debris. Crude, brutal devices packed with enough explosive force to crack warship hulls. They were not elegant. They were not advanced. They were cheap, simple, and there were millions of them. The Oort cloud itself had become a weapon. The first wave of the Purge fleet was shredded. Ships that had survived for tens of thousands of years were ripped apart by explosives hidden inside dirty snowballs. The perfect formation broke as captains tried to maneuver around the minefield, crashing into each other, blocking firing lanes, turning order into chaos. Tolvar screamed orders: reform, push through, ignore the losses. The fleet was vast. It could absorb damage. It would simply crush through the minefield and continue. And that was when the drones came. They appeared from everywhere, behind asteroids, inside hollowed-out comets, from hidden launch pods scattered across millions of kilometers. Small, fast, cheap, and completely expendable. Each one was no bigger than a dining table, armed with a single weapon, and guided by a decentralized intelligence that did not need orders from a flagship. They thought for themselves. They adapted. They learned. And they did not fight like anything the Council had ever seen. The drones swarmed. They hit in groups of 100, targeting engines, sensors, and communication arrays. They did not try to destroy the massive warships. They blinded them, crippled them, cut them off from each other. When the Council ships turned to fight, the drones scattered and reformed behind them. When the ships tried to hold formation, the drones found the gaps and poured through like water through cracks in a wall. It was guerrilla warfare in 3 dimensions, and the Purge fleet had no idea how to respond. Their tactics were 40,000 years old. Their commanders had trained for battles against enemies who stood in neat lines and waited to die. This was not a battle. This was a swarm of insects, eating a giant alive, one bite at a time. Tolvar watched his tactical display with growing horror. His fleet was not being defeated, it was being dismantled. Ship by ship, system by system. The humans were not trying to match his firepower, they were making his firepower irrelevant. Then the real fleet arrived. Admiral Jihei had been waiting, while the mines and drones did their work. Breaking formations, creating confusion, drawing attention. She had held the human fleet back, hidden in the shadow of a rogue gas giant, 3 light minutes away. 400 ships. That was all humanity had. 400 against 80,000. By any sane calculation, it was suicide. But Jihai was not interested in sane calculations. She had studied Tolvar's fleet for weeks. She knew its command structure. She knew that every order flowed from a single point, Tolvar's flagship, a massive vessel at the center of the formation. Kill the flagship, and the fleet's ancient automated protocols would activate, and those protocols had not been updated in millennia. Without fresh orders, the ships would default to defensive positions and wait for commands that would never come. All ships, Jihai said into the fleet-wide channel. Her voice was flat and calm. Spear formation. Target the command ship. Nothing else matters. 400 human warships accelerated out of the darkness like a thrown blade. Dowen was in the lead assault craft. He had escaped the Pale Throne 2 days earlier with Teho, Yuna, and 4 Marines in a stolen shuttle. A desperate, violent breakout that had left scorch marks on the station's docking bay, and a very angry Council security force behind them. Now he was exactly where he wanted to be, in a cockpit, flying towards something he could hit. The human fleet cut through the disorganized purge fleet like a knife through smoke. The Council ships, still reeling from the mines and drones, could not regroup fast enough to block them. Jihei's 400 ships flew in a tight spear, ignoring everything except the flagship. Dowen fired the first shot. His assault craft punched through the flagship's outer hull, and opened a gap wide enough for the heavy cruisers behind him. They poured fire into the wound. The flagship's shields flickered, failed, and collapsed. Tolvar had 3 seconds to understand what was happening before his bridge disappeared in white light. The flagship died, and just as Jihei had predicted, the purge fleet stopped. Not all at once. It was more like watching a machine lose power. Ships slowed, formations dissolved, weapons went silent. The ancient protocols activated, and 80,000 warships began pulling back to defensive positions, waiting for orders from a command ship that no longer existed. They waited, and nothing came. The retreat began slowly, then all at once. Ships that had conquered civilizations turned and ran from a species that had learned to fly between stars less than a century ago. On Mars, Suho was sitting in the relay station break room, surrounded by other engineers and workers who had gathered around a single screen. They had watched the battle in near real time, delayed only by the speed of light. When the flagship fell, someone gasped. When the retreat began, someone started crying. Suho did not do either. He sat down slowly on the metal bench, put his shaking hands on his knees, and whispered to no one in particular, "We are still here." Admiral Jihei did not chase the retreating fleet. She stood on the bridge of the undying soul, watched the 80,000 points of light pull away, and opened a broadcast on every galactic frequency. Her voice went out to every relay station, every hidden receiver, every species that was watching. This was defense, not conquest. We have no quarrel with the peoples of the Council, only with the chains you placed on them. Humanity will not kneel, but we will extend our hand to anyone who wishes to stand. The stars were quiet. And then across the galaxy, in places the Council had never thought to watch, something began to happen. On a dozen worlds, then 100, then more, alien hands and claws and tentacles and things with no human name began transmitting a single symbol to each other, passing it from system to system, like a flame being shared between candles. The symbol was simple. It was a word. A human word. The first word that had shaken the galaxy in 100,000 years. 6 months passed, and the galaxy did not look the same. It started quietly, the way all revolutions do. A small reptilian species on the edge of Council space stopped sending its annual tribute shipment. Then a cluster of aquatic worlds in the mid-rim declared their mining reserves closed to Council collection. Then 17 species, some large, some barely a footnote in galactic records, formally withdrew from the tribute system entirely, citing a phrase that their translators rendered differently in every language, but always meant the same thing. We choose to stand. The Council fractured like old glass. For 100,000 years, the system had held because everyone believed it would hold forever. Fear was the foundation, and fear only worked as long as no one tested it. But Tejo had tested it. Humanity had tested it. And when the Purge Fleet, the Council's ultimate weapon, its final argument, had been turned back by a species younger than some Council members' furniture, the fear broke. And once fear breaks, it does not come back. Grand Arbiter Volmari watched it happen from the Pale Throne. He sat on his crystal platform in the empty Hall of Tribute, empty now because fewer and fewer delegates came and felt his world ending, not with fire, not with war, with silence. The silence of species that had stopped answering his calls, the silence of seats left vacant, the silence of a system dying, not because it was destroyed, but because people simply stopped believing in it. He was old, 9,000 years old. He had seen civilizations rise and fall like waves on a shore. He had always believed that the Council was different, that it was permanent, eternal, the natural order of things. Now he sat alone in a hall built for thousands, and understood, for the first time, that he had been wrong. On the other side of the galaxy, something new was being born. They called it the Free Worlds Compact. It had no emperor, no arbiter, no throne. It was a coalition, messy, loud, disorganized, and alive in a way the Council had never been. Its founding members were an unlikely group, humanity, 3 mid-rim species that had been among the first to withdraw from the tribute, and 1 reptilian delegate who had risked everything to pass a message through a hidden channel 6 months ago. Ressi stood at the center of it. She had spent 4,000 years as a quiet observer in the Council, watching species kneel and pay and disappear into silence. She had told herself that there was nothing she could do, that the system was too big, too old, too powerful. And then she had watched a human say one word and prove her wrong. Now she was done watching. Tejo and Yuna returned to the Pale Throne on a spring morning. Spring by Earth's calendar. Meaningless in space, but Yuna liked the symbolism. They came not as prisoners this time, but as representatives of the Compact. Their ship was the same Horizon that had carried them the first time, now flanked by escort vessels from 6 different species. Darwin stood at the airlock in fresh armor, arms crossed, looking exactly as suspicious as he had the first time. "I still do not like this place," he muttered. "You do not like any place," Yuna replied. "That is because most places are trying to kill us." "Not this time," Tejo said. "Probably." The Hall of Tribute was half empty. The species that remained watched the human delegation enter with expressions that ranged from curiosity to grudging respect to something that might, in the right light, have been hope. Ressi walked beside Tejo, her green scales catching the pale light of the hall. She held her head high. She had earned that. Volmari requested a private audience. Tejo agreed. They met in a small chamber behind the hall, just the 2 of them. No guards, no translators, no audience. The room was plain white, lit by the same cold glow as everything else on the station. Volmari sat on one side. Tejo sat on the other. Between them there was a table and 100,000 years of history. Volmari looked diminished. His crystal robes, once brilliant and alive, were dull and cracked in places. His 7 limbs moved slowly, as if each one carried a weight that had not been there before. His 4 black eyes studied Tejo with an expression that the captain could not quite read. "I have a question," Volmari said. His voice was quiet, not the amplified godlike voice of the hall. "Old and tired and real." "Ask," Tejo said. "Why?" The word hung in the air. "You could have paid the tribute. Your species could have lived quietly under our protection. You could have grown slowly, safely, without risk. You would have lost some resources, some territory, some pride, but you would have survived. Instead, you said one word, and you nearly destroyed everything. Your worlds, your people, your future. All of it, balanced on the edge of a knife." Volmari leaned forward slightly. "Why did you risk everything over one word?" Tejo was quiet for a moment. He looked at the old arbiter sitting across from him, this ancient creature who had ruled the galaxy through fear and called it order, who had watched 300 species kneel and believed that kneeling was natural. "Because that one word was the only honest thing we could say," Tejo replied. "And sometimes, one honest word is enough to remind an entire galaxy what freedom sounds like." Volmari did not respond immediately. He sat very still, his cracked robes catching the light in dull, fractured patterns. The silence stretched. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something ending. Then, slowly, Volmari raised his 7 limbs and began to remove his crystal robes. He unclasped them one piece at a time, the shoulder guards, the chest plate, the long trailing cape that had dragged behind him for 9,000 years. Each piece he set carefully on the floor, where they lay like shed skin, glowing faintly and then going dark. When he was done, he looked smaller. Just a creature, old and tired and bare. "The tribute is over," he said. No one else heard him say it. There was no grand announcement. Just 2 beings in a small white room, and the quiet sound of an empire letting go. The ceremony that followed was not about power. It was not about victory. It was about a beginning. The Hall of Tribute was renamed. They called it the Hall of Voices. The crystal platform where Volmari had sat for millennia was removed. In its place, a simple podium stood at the center of the floor, at the same level as everyone else. Yuna stepped up to it. She looked out at the species that filled the hall, fewer than before, but different now. They were not sitting in silence, waiting to be told what to do. They were talking to each other, arguing, laughing, making noise. It was messy and chaotic and imperfect, and it was the most beautiful sound Yuna had ever heard. She spoke, not about war, not about the battle, or the purge fleet, or the word that had started everything. She spoke about what came next, about cooperation between species that had never been allowed to cooperate, about shared discovery, about building something that did not require fear to survive. Tejo watched from the back of the hall. Dawan stood beside him, arms folded, pretending he was not moved. Admiral Jihei watched from the bridge of the Undying Soul, orbiting far away, in the quiet dark, her face lit by the soft glow of a relay screen. Suho watched from a small cafe on Mars, sitting at a table near the window, surrounded by strangers who were all quietly listening to the same broadcast. The cafe was warm. Someone had made coffee. Outside, the red dust of Mars caught the late afternoon sun and turned gold. Yuna reached the end of her address. She paused, and the hall fell quiet. Not the old silence, the one made of fear. A new silence, the silence of people choosing to listen. "For 100,000 years," she said, "you were told to kneel. You were told that obedience was safety, and that silence was peace. You were told that this was the way things had to be." She looked out at the 1,000 faces watching her. Alien and strange and wonderful, every single one. "Now I ask you, not as conquerors, but as neighbors. What do you choose? The answer did not come all at once. It came in waves, spreading from the front rows to the back, from the hall to the relay stations, from the relay stations to the ships, from the ships to the planets, from the planets to the stars. It came in 1,000 languages and 1,000 voices, spoken by creatures that breathed air, and creatures that breathed methane, and creatures that did not breathe at all. But every voice said the same thing. Not in anger, not in defiance, in something quieter and stronger than either. A choice. No. And across the galaxy, for the first time in 100,000 years, that word did not mean rebellion. It meant freedom.